Course 103, Rural Society and Polity, Unit 4, Fundamentals of Rural Demography and Economy. We have covered Lesson 1 on Rural Population, Rural Demography, Lesson 2 on Rural Economy. This is the third lesson on Rural Labour Force. What rural labour force looks like, what is its composition, what is the participation of women in rural labour force. The objective of the present lesson is to make you aware of the composition of rural labour force, and secondly also to know about women's participation in rural labour force. The structure of the lesson is as follows. We will first familiarize ourselves with some basic terms and then move on to understand and have a look at some statistics on labour force participation rate, on worker participation ratio, on sector-wise distribution of workforce, on education levels of workforce, on rural wages, and also some reasons for the not in labour force. And then lastly, we will have a look at female labour force participation in rural India. To start, let us first get ourselves acquainted with some basic terms. Labour force, out of labour force, employed, unemployed, etc. Labour force comprises of all the persons above a minimum legal age who are either working, that is they are employed, as well as those who are seeking work or who are available for work but unemployed. The category of workers or those who are considered as employed refers to persons who are engaged in any economic activity. It includes those who have temporarily abstained from work for reasons of illness, injury, physical disability, or being away for festivals or religious social functions, or even other contingencies. Now, the category of those who seek or work or are available for work or the unemployed refers to persons who, owing to lack of work, are unable to work, but they seek work through employment exchanges or through intermediaries or through friends or by making applications to prospective employers, essentially those who have expressed their willingness and availability for doing work. The term out of labour force comprises persons who are not working and at the same time they are not seeking work or available for work. Under this category are students, those who engage in domestic duties, pensioners, those living on alms, disabled persons, those who are too young or too old, etc. Going back to labour force. Here in the category of workers, we see there are further divisions. So first is self-employed, second is regular wage or salaried employees, and third is casual wage labour. The self-employed refers to persons who operate their own enterprises, either farm or non-farm enterprises, or those who are engaged independently in a profession, or those who do trade on their own account or with one or a few partners. The essential feature of the self-employed is that they have autonomy, that is how, where and when to produce, and they also have economic independence of market, the scale of operation, money for carrying out their operations. The second, the regular wage or salaried employees, refers to persons working for others in other people's farm or non-farm enterprises, and these could be household or non-household level, and in return they get salary or wages on a regular basis, not on a daily or periodic work contract, but who get salary or wages on a regular basis. The third, the casual wage labourers, refers to persons who are casually engaged in other people's farm or non-farm enterprises, and in return they get wage according to the terms of a daily or periodic work contract. They are employed temporarily, occasionally, usually for a specific short-term period, hours, days, weeks, etc. Usually in rural areas, one category of casual laborers that can be seen who normally engage themselves in public works activities. Some other terms. Labor force participation rate. It's simply the ratio of the country's labor force to its total population. Similarly, workforce participation rate refers to the proportion of the country's population that is actively engaged in work, or those who are actually employed, the proportion of those workers to total population. Another term, unemployment rate. It is the percentage of persons in the country's labor force that are unemployed. The number of unemployed persons divided by the total labor force. Unorganized or informal sector means all privately owned but unregistered enterprises which employ workers, and the workers do not receive any formal legal protection or any form of social insurance like old age pensions, allowances, other benefits. About 82% of the workforce in India is in insecure employment in the informal sector, working for low wages in extremely vulnerable conditions. The primary source of statistics on labor force is the Periodic Labor Force Survey, which was devised to collect annual estimates and even on quarterly basis for urban areas specifically. The Periodic Labor Force Survey provides estimates for the participation of population in economic activity, the structure of employment and unemployment in the country, labor force details against age, gender, education, industry, occupation, wage, etc. Let us now look at some figures, data and statistics in order to understand the composition of rural labor force. The table that you see gives overall figures on population and economically active persons in rural areas in India by gender, male, female, and this is for two reference time periods, 2004 to 2005 and 2011 to 2012. The population is reported here in million. The labor force participation rate in the total rural population stands at 41% for 2011-12. If this is seen separately for male and female, we see that for males it is at 55% and it is much higher than what it is for females, which is 25%, both figures for 2011-12. In actual numbers, the total male labor force in rural areas stands at 239 billion, of which 235 are workers, which means very few as unemployed, almost negligible. Similar is the pattern for female labor force, where the absolute number is reported at 104 million and workforce itself is 102. So, fewer unemployed, almost negligible. Now, moving a step further, of the workforce, we see that maximum are working in the agriculture sector and primarily as cultivators. The labor force participation rate in the more recent years, if we see, as is depicted in the graph here across three time frames, 2017-18, 18-19 and 19-20. Across these 3 years, we see that the labor force participation rate for rural areas is higher when compared to urban areas and also when compared to the totals for India. So, the bar for rural areas is in the color blue, for urban areas it is in red, and for India total the figures are shown in the bar colored green. We see that in 2017-18 for rural areas, the labor force participation rate stands at 37. In 2018-19, this increased to 37.7, and 2019-20, a further increase is noted to 40.8. If we disaggregate the labor force participation rate for rural areas by gender and look at it for rural male and female, we see what is depicted in the given graph. What we see here is across over a period of years, so from 1977-78 until 2019-20. We see that the labor force participation rate is higher for rural male population, which is the bars given in the darker shade of blue. In 2019-20, it stood at 56.3 for rural male, whereas for rural female, the figures are much lower. In 2019-20, it stood only at 24.7. With regard to worker population ratio, that is those actually working, the graph here gives us figures across 3 time periods, again 2017-18, 2018-19 and 2019-20. Across these 3 years, the worker population ratio for rural areas is higher when compared to urban areas and also when compared to India totals. In 2017-18, in rural areas, it stands at 35. In 2018-19, it increased to 35.8 and further increased to 39.2 in the year 2019-20. If we disaggregate the workforce for rural areas by gender and to that we add sectors, then what we get is depicted in this given graph. The figures for rural male are depicted in a lighter shade of blue, while for rural female are depicted in a darker shade of blue. We see that agriculture sector has the maximum workforce participation in rural areas, both for rural male as well as for rural female. But within agriculture, we see that the workforce participation among rural female is higher than that of rural male. A look at the education levels of rural workers is depicted in the given table. Here we see that the percentage of rural workers as per 3 categories of education levels: secondary education and above, with technical education and with vocational training, and this is given for male and female and across 2 time frames, 2004-5 and 2011-12. So the table here depicts that the highest percent of workers have secondary education and above. Second in line are those who have received vocational training. Now these figures are for total, irrespective of male or female. Now workers with technical education are very few and they constitute a small percent. This trend is seen for both the time periods 2004-5 and also 2011-12. Now when it comes to segregating male and female rural workers, we see that among male workers, again the highest percent of workers have secondary education and above, followed by those who received vocational training. But for female rural workers, we see that the highest percent is of those with vocational training and then followed by those with secondary education. Moving on to understanding rural wages. The graph here depicts the trajectory of rural wages from 1999 onwards until 2020-21. And we see that the curve has not been steady or consistent. The growth in the overall rural wages has seen several dips over the years and a particularly steep growth around 2009-10 up to 2011-12, where in 2011-12 there was the highest growth. Soon thereafter there is a steep dip, and then the gradual growth again is seen and again a dip. In the last 2 years, closer to 2020 onwards, we see a slight rise again. Next, we have a look at the not in labor force population and the reasons for why they are not in labor force. So the reasons are shown in the table given here as education, as being engaged in domestic activities or others. Other reasons include they could be children in the age group of 0 to 4 years, pensioners, disabled, etc. And we see that the time periods that are given in this table are to 2004-5 and 2011-12. And this is given both for male, female and for a total population of rural India. In the table, we see that the overall, the rural not in labor force population is so for the major reason of education, then for domestic activities and then others. When we segregate this into male, female, then the reasons differ. For females, the reason is largely engagement in domestic activities and then education. While for males, it is education first and then followed by the reason of others. Domestic activities witness an almost negligible reason for rural males. Female labor force participation rate. Now, this is important to stimulate economic growth, but unfortunately, Indian labor market is characterized by low female labor force participation rate. Male labor force participation rate has been more or less constant, but for females, it has been moving downwards, and the decline has been driven largely by rural female labor force participation. The reasons for this low participation is that women face many barriers to entry. Although educational attainment for rural females has improved considerably, adequate jobs were not created to absorb the new female entrants in the labor force. Apart from the levels of education, fertility rates, age of marriage, extent of urbanization, also some other reasons. And there are also conditions of work like gender pay gap, lack of security of getting work, double shifts of work at home as also outside. These are various challenges that women face while entering the labor force. And much of women's work also tends to be underreported and not accounted for in official statistics. As per World Bank estimates, India falls in the bottom 10 countries in the world in terms of overall female labor force participation. Religion and caste also play a role in determining women's participation. So, for instance, in rural India, we see that higher the caste, greater are the restrictions on women's mobility and participation in economic activity. Regarding the nature of work, most rural women are engaged in agriculture and allied activities. They are less likely to be found in non-agricultural jobs. More than a quarter of the women are engaged in agriculture and allied activities, and a significant share of the work performed by women is unpaid household and care work. Even among self-employed women who perform manufacturing activities, the earnings are low, hours of work are very long, and social protection is almost negligible. The gender wage gap is also high in rural areas. This also deters rural women's labor force participation. A quick look at some data on wages for casual workers in rural areas. We see in the graph here the time period of 93-94, 99 to 2000, 2004-05 and 2007-08. For rural male, the data is depicted in the graph in blue color. For rural female, it's in red, and total figures are depicted in green. Wages for rural females, we see, are below the overall rural wages and further below the wages for rural males. Although over the years we see that there has been a steady growth, yet the gap between the wages for rural male and rural female remains quite high. So, if we were to have a further look on wage rates of rural labor and across different types of works, we see what is given in the adjoining graph. This is for the reference year of 2007-08, and here we see the depiction across MGNREGS works, non-MGNREGS works and other types of works. For rural male, the figures are given in the color blue. For female, it is in red, and overall or total rural figures in green. If we look at the first set of bars here, which is for MGNREGS works, we note that the wages for rural females is higher than that for overall rural wages and wages for rural males. It's actually at par with the other two, but a little higher. For non-MGNREGS works, it is lower for rural females when compared with rural males and rural persons in total. And for other types of works, it's very low in comparison to the other two. The behavior of labor market depends on the trends and patterns of the overall economy, and the volatility in the economy is reflected in the domestic labor market as well. I conclude the lesson with a to-do activity for you. There is a graph that is given here. Interpret this graph and what it says about labor force participation rate in rural areas. Put down a key set of 3 to 4 points. Thank you.